They mocked her old uniform. Said she didn't belong on the range, too quiet, too plain, just another desk officer in faded fatigues. But within minutes, their smirks faded, and by the end of the day, a general stood in silence and saluted her. This isn't a story about rank. It's a story about discipline, restraint, and the kind of military respect you don't earn through words, only through action. Stay with us, because what happened next, no one on that base ever forgot. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. And let us know where you're listening from. We'd love to see how far this story reaches. The morning air over Fort Kingswell carried the sharp scent of old gravel and spent brass. Across the firing range, soldiers moved with casual repetition, adjusting scopes, checking ammunition, and trading familiar jokes. But amid the rhythm of routine, one figure stood out not because of what she did, but because of what she wore. Lieutenant Arya Dalton stepped onto the range in a faded, outdated uniform, sleeves rolled low, insignias dulled with time. It wasn't regulation breaking, just old. A visual contrast that drew quiet smirks from younger soldiers nearby. To them, she didn't look the part, too reserved, too plain. The kind of officer who belonged behind a map board, not a rifle. She moved with calm precision, saying little. Some assumed she was lost, others whispered guesses about admin duty or reassignments, but Arya didn't offer answers. She found a quiet spot near the benches and waited not for attention, but for permission. From a distance, her presence seemed like a mistake, unremarkable, misplaced. They didn't know what the badge hidden beneath that sleeve meant. They didn't know she wasn't there to prove anything. She was just waiting to be underestimated one more time. Sergeant First Class Mason Riker noticed her before anyone else did. He didn't call attention to her right away. Not yet. Instead, he kept his voice loud and his stance open, working the crowd of junior soldiers around him like a man who had long since learned that confidence, not silence, earned respect in uniform. Riker had seen plenty of officers pass through the range, most forgettable, some tolerable, a few worth listening to. Arya Dalton, at first glance, didn't land in any of those categories. To him, she looked like a file clerk in camouflage. She waited near the benches without disrupting anything, hands clasped behind her back, calm, silent. That bothered him more than it should have. So when she finally stepped forward and addressed him, her voice low, clear, formal. It didn't take much for him to let his tone drop 2 degrees colder. "I'm requesting access to the sniper qualification lane, Sergeant." The laughter came before the words. One of the corporals near the spotting scopes choked on his coffee. Another muttered something under his breath, just loud enough to stir a ripple of amusement. Riker didn't smile, not yet. He wanted this to play out. He turned toward her, took a few slow steps until he stood close enough to cast a long shadow across her boots. "Sniper lane," he repeated. "Lieutenant, this lane isn't for coordination officers. It's for shooters, real ones." A few heads turned. Soldiers drifted closer, drawn by tone as much as by the scene itself. Someone added, "She still wears the old BDUs, man. Bet she's never even touched a scope." Arya said nothing. Riker wasn't finished. "I've got limited range time, and I'm not about to waste it on someone looking to check a box on a training record." Still, Arya didn't move. Her posture held, not rigid, just centered, like someone used to holding still for longer than most people could stay quiet. One soldier tried to whisper a joke about Zen breathing. Another asked mockingly if she needed a yoga mat for her sniper stance. The laughter came again, not cruel, just casual, comfortable. It was easy to mock someone who didn't push back. But Arya didn't flinch. Not even when Riker leaned in slightly and lowered his voice. "You want to take a shot at this, you're going to earn it." He expected her to leave, or at least to hesitate. He expected some flicker of discomfort, a nervous breath, a shift of the eyes, but there was nothing. Just the same steady look, unshaken. "Then give me one lane," she said. "One shot." That was when it changed. The laughter didn't stop right away, but it started to feel thinner, less certain, like a joke that had gone on a beat too long. Some of the younger troops turned their heads, no longer smiling. A few, like Staff Sergeant Ward, had already stopped laughing minutes earlier. Ward had been watching quietly from the side, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He'd seen her posture, the way she moved, the way she hadn't looked around once for validation. He'd seen that before in other places, under different skies. Riker, still clinging to the moment, waved a hand toward the firing lane with a sigh. Fine, one lane, but don't expect a second. Arya walked forward, slow and deliberate. The crowd parted instinctively. She didn't speak, didn't explain herself. She just moved to the rifle bench like she'd done it 100 times before. She laid a hand on the rifle stock, checked the bolt, adjusted the bipod without hesitation. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence, not showy, not rushed. Then came the part nobody expected. She rolled her sleeve just slightly to free her wrist. And that's when Ward saw it. A glimpse of ink, not decorative, not flashy, just clean lines, crosshairs, and numbers spaced with mathematical precision. It wasn't art, it was data, the kind only a seasoned shooter would mark not for style, but for memory. It wasn't regulation, but it wasn't something you argued with either. Ward's expression shifted, a tightening at the jawline, a narrowing of the eyes. His voice cut through the quiet. Winds left to right, 7 to 9, gusts at 12. Arya didn't thank him. She just nodded barely, then returned her focus to the scope. The first shot cracked across the range. It hit just left of center. She didn't react, just adjusted. Second shot tighter, 2 inches off. Third center hit, clean, unforgiving. Now there was no laughter, no smirks, no commentary. Just silence. Riker crossed his arms, his face stiff. A test, he told himself. She got lucky. One grouping doesn't mean anything. He pointed to the 1,000-yard plate, voice louder than before. Let's see if it holds. Arya didn't argue. She simply adjusted the elevation, shifted her weight, closed her eyes for half a breath, and fired. Steel rang in the distance. A clean hit. And just like that, the turning point was behind them. The echo from the 1,000-yard steel still lingered when the metal door of the range control shack creaked open. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension like a distant warning, subtle, final. Someone stepped out. At first, the soldiers didn't react. Just another instructor, maybe. Another cadre member checking on range activity. Then they saw the uniform, and everything stopped. General Nathaniel Carradine, base commander, former special operations, known for 3 things: his silence, his memory, and the fact that he didn't show up unless something mattered. Conversations died mid-sentence, shoulders straightened, even Riker swallowed hard. The general didn't speak. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes went straight to Arya Dalton. He had been inside, behind the glass, watching, and he had seen everything. Arya was still behind the rifle, her body relaxed but not disengaged. She didn't lift her head when the general approached. She didn't need to. Carradine moved with quiet purpose, the kind that makes space wherever it goes. Soldiers stepped aside without being told. It was instinctive. Something about his presence shifted the weight of the air. He stopped a few feet from her, didn't speak right away. Then, in a voice low enough that it barely stirred the morning breeze, he asked, "Lieutenant, may I see your badge?" Not her ID, not her orders, her badge. Arya paused. Not out of fear, but because the question was specific, deliberate. She knew what he meant. Slowly, she sat back from the rifle. Then, without speaking, she rolled her left sleeve higher, far enough to reveal the full design inked into her forearm. The crowd leaned forward. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a sniper's ledger. Numbers, 4 of them, cleanly spaced. Distances, 143, 1247, 983, 1302, not decorative, not for show. Surrounding the numbers, wind vectors, mirage markers, scope corrections, details only another shooter would understand. Details Carradine had seen before. Years ago, in an after-action report from northeastern Afghanistan, an ambush, 2 joint teams pinned down in a valley, no air support, no evac, just one unknown sniper unregistered providing overwatch from a distant ridge, 4 confirmed kills, all beyond 1,000 yards, all in fading light and shifting wind. The shots had saved lives, but the shooter's identity had been redacted, classified, forgotten. Until now, the general's breath caught not loud, but sharp enough that Ward, standing nearby, heard it. Carradine's gaze stayed fixed on her forearm. He spoke again, even quieter than before. "Where did you earn those?" Arya met his eyes for the first time. Her answer was simple, measured. "Afghanistan, before I commissioned." Nothing more, nothing less. Silence rippled through the range, and not the awkward kind, the kind that happens when truth arrives uninvited. Briggs took a step back, his mouth open, searching for something to say, but nothing came. A few of the corporals lowered their heads, others just stood there, as if unsure of what they'd just witnessed. Even Riker didn't speak. His arms, once crossed in defiance, now hung stiff at his sides. His face paled. The weight of everything he'd said, every mocking word, now hung around his shoulders like lead. Carradine, still facing Arya, didn't move for a moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he stepped back, stood at attention, and saluted. Not a casual nod, not a polite gesture, a formal military salute. The kind offered not to rank, but to service. Arya returned it without fanfare. No smile, no gloating, just a clean, precise motion. And in that moment, everything changed. The crowd behind them, dozens of soldiers, many of whom had laughed, scoffed, dismissed her, now stood silent. Not out of discipline, out of respect. No one cheered, no one clapped. That wasn't the kind of moment this was. Ward exhaled slowly. He had suspected, but now he knew. Riker's eyes dropped to the gravel, not in defeat, but in recognition. He'd been wrong. Deeply, publicly, and unforgivably wrong. And Arya Dalton hadn't said a single word to prove it. No one moved. The silence that followed General Carradine's salute didn't just settle. It pressed against every soldier who had spoken too loudly, laughed too easily, or judged too quickly. For a few seconds, Arya Dalton remained still, her sleeve still rolled just enough to expose the ink beneath. Then she slowly pulled it down, not to hide, but to signal that there was nothing left to prove. The moment had passed, but its weight stayed behind. Riker turned slightly, as if trying to retreat without taking a step. His voice, once loud and commanding, had vanished. What could he say that he hadn't known, that he'd misjudged, that would only confirm what everyone now understood? He had mocked a soldier whose service went deeper than his own understanding of the battlefield. Nearby, Corporal Briggs shifted uncomfortably. Earlier, he'd been one of the loudest voices. Now he couldn't lift his eyes from the dirt beneath his boots. The jokes he'd made, quick, easy, thoughtless, now echoed back with sharpness he hadn't expected, not because anyone was angry, but because no one was laughing anymore. Staff Sergeant Ward remained in place. He hadn't smiled earlier, and he didn't flinch now. If anything, he stood straighter. Something inside him clicked into place, the final confirmation of every instinct he'd had about Arya from the moment she stepped onto the range. She wasn't pretending, she wasn't proving. She was simply doing what she'd done before, in places most of them had never seen, under conditions they could barely imagine. The perspective shifted slowly, not with gasps or applause, but with posture, with stillness, with eyes that no longer looked through her, but at her, trying to understand what they had missed. And they had missed a lot. Arya stepped away from the rifle, calm, unhurried. The mechanics of her movement were unchanged, but the perception of those movements had transformed. What once looked like hesitancy now appeared as discipline. What once seemed like detachment now resembled focus. What once felt forgettable now demanded quiet respect. She wiped her palms on her trousers, not out of nervousness, but because the dirt felt familiar, honest. Ward walked closer, keeping a respectful distance. He didn't speak, just offered her a simple nod, one professional to another. She returned it. No thanks exchanged, no explanation offered. There was no need. At the edge of the range, a few more soldiers had gathered. Word spreads fast in places like Fort Kingswell, especially when it challenges a shared assumption. The crowd wasn't large, but the air felt crowded with reconsideration. One infantryman whispered to another, "She ever been on our roster?" "No, not ours," came the reply. "She's from fire support." That made it worse. To them, she had been just another map officer, a paperwork lieutenant. Now she was something else entirely, and they were reevaluating every quiet face they'd ever ignored. Riker finally stepped forward. His movements were stiff, mechanical. He wasn't used to standing on this side of the lesson, and the lesson had been public. He cleared his throat. "Lieutenant," but the words failed him. Arya didn't speak. She simply turned, offering him the same neutral expression she had worn since the beginning. Not angry, not vindictive, just steady. Riker drew in a slow breath. Then, finally, his right hand came up in a formal salute. There was no pride in the motion, only recognition. Arya returned the gesture with the same precision as before, short, respectful, and without ceremony. She did not hold it longer than required. She did not smile. That, more than anything, unsettled the crowd, because she had nothing to gain from this. No audience to win over, no speech to deliver, no satisfaction to show. She had come for the qualification. She had received something far more lasting. As Arya walked away from the bench, a strange quiet followed her. Not the silence of embarrassment, not the silence of fear. It was the silence of reassessment. Every soldier watching her now saw something different, not because she had changed, but because she hadn't shouted, she hadn't boasted, she hadn't reminded anyone of what she had done. She had simply acted, and they had all witnessed it. Some of them, maybe only a few, would remember this day more clearly than any exercise or briefing they attended that month, not because of the shots fired, but because of the assumptions shattered. The sun had shifted higher over Fort Kingswell by the time Arya Dalton stepped away from the firing line. Shadows grew shorter, but the memory of what had just unfolded remained long, stretching across every conversation, every sideways glance, every unspoken thought. The range was still active, but the tone had changed. Orders were quieter, movement more measured. It was the kind of shift that didn't come from regulation, it came from respect, earned, not declared. Arya didn't walk quickly. There was no urgency in her step, only intention. She passed the control shack with her sleeve now buttoned back down, not to hide the ink, but because it had already done its job. General Carradine had returned inside, but not before giving a single, final order to the rangemaster. It was clear, unambiguous. Flag her for sniper selection, effective immediately. Inside the admin building, word was already moving. One of the operations clerks had overheard. Another had seen the general salute. Rumors, as they often do, began splitting in every direction, half wrong, half right, and none of them fully capturing the truth. By the time Arya entered the side hallway leading to the support offices, she was no longer just the quiet, forward observer. She was now the soldier everyone had overlooked and the one they would now have to reckon with. Major Halston, head of range qualifications, stepped out of his office as she passed. "Dalton," he called out. His voice wasn't harsh, just surprised. She stopped, turned. He glanced at the folder in his hand, then at her. "You're being added to the sniper selection board. General's directive." "I understand," she said simply. He paused. "I thought you were—" "I was support," she replied. "I still am, but I've done other things before that." Halston nodded slowly. He didn't ask for details. Something in his face shifted a flicker of unease, not at her, but at himself. He had walked past her a dozen times in the past year, had probably filed reports with her signature, had likely never once considered that she was anything more than efficient. Now he knew better, or at least he knew not to assume again. Back outside, a small group had gathered at the far end of the range, not for official training that had resumed at reduced volume, but to talk. Low tones, folded arms, furrowed brows. They were talking about her. Briggs stood in the back of that group, arms crossed tight. He wasn't smirking anymore. He wasn't speaking much at all. The laugh lines around his eyes looked older somehow, or maybe just less certain. "You think she'll go through with selection?" one soldier asked. "She already passed the hard part," another replied. Ward, listening but not inserting himself, finally spoke up. "She didn't just pass. She embarrassed all of us without saying a word." The group went quiet. Later that afternoon, Arya received her formal packet selection dates, medical pre-checks, and clearance authorizations. The staff sergeant who handed it to her paused for a moment, looked down at the papers, then back at her. He didn't say congratulations. He didn't need to. His silence felt more honest than any praise would have. At dinner, she sat alone, same table, same chair, same way she always had. A few soldiers noticed, some nodded, some didn't know what to do with the new information inside their heads. She ate without hurry, her tray methodically divided, her focus never leaving the space in front of her. To Arya. The day hadn't changed much. She had fired rounds before. She had waited in wind and silence before. She had been overlooked before. What changed today wasn't her. It was the permission to move forward without hiding. Sniper selection was not guaranteed success. Everyone knew that. The attrition rate was brutal. Physicals, qualifications, endurance, patience. It stripped away ego faster than any shouted drill ever could. But Arya wasn't worried about the process. She had already lived through tests that weren't listed on any form. And now, finally, she had the chance to prove herself again, not for pride, not for recognition, but because being underestimated had cost her more time than she was willing to keep paying. She had walked through enough quiet rooms where no one had asked about her past. Now, those same rooms were starting to listen. The next morning, her name appeared on the selection board. It was typed in the same font, the same spacing as every other candidate, but among those who read it, there was no confusion anymore. Arya Dalton wasn't a rumor. She wasn't an admin mistake. She was a name they'd remember not because she stood out, but because she had never needed to. Sniper selection at Fort Kingswell wasn't ceremonial. It was quiet, clinical, and designed to wear people down slowly, not through chaos, but through controlled discipline. Each day began before first light. No shouting, no barking, just a quiet knock on the barracks door and a list of tasks that grew heavier by the hour. Gear checks, load carries, range estimation under duress, sleep deprivation without drama. For most candidates, the pressure didn't show in obvious ways. It crept into their posture, into their breathing, into the moments when silence became harder to endure than motion. Arya Dalton didn't speak much during those early days. She wasn't cold, she wasn't aloof. She simply understood that every unnecessary word was wasted energy. The other candidates were mostly younger. Some still carried that recruit sharpness, all angles and effort. Others, seasoned infantrymen, tried to mask their doubts with confidence. Arya didn't try to be either. She just moved with quiet efficiency, the kind that didn't invite attention but couldn't avoid it either. During a stress fire evolution, one candidate flinched at the shot next to him, breaking form. The instructor barked a correction, but Arya had already stepped in. She didn't lecture, didn't offer comfort, just adjusted the shooter's hand placement and nodded once. It was barely noticed, but not by everyone. Ward, now observing parts of the training cycle as cadre support, kept his distance, but his eyes found her often. He didn't interrupt, he didn't step in, he didn't need to. She wasn't the same woman who had walked onto the range weeks ago, and she hadn't changed at all. Midway through week 2, during a wind call exercise, a group of candidates began arguing over mirage direction and scope holds. Tempers ran hot, not hostile, just fatigued. Arya stood nearby, her notebook already closed, calculations complete. One of the younger candidates finally turned to her, half out of frustration. "Dalton, what's your call?" She looked up, not surprised, not smug. "Left to right," she said, 9 to 11, Mirage confirms it. The group paused, checked again. She was right. No debate followed. It wasn't that they trusted her immediately. It's that her answers didn't need defending. By week 3, she had become the kind of presence that others measured themselves against, not out of competition, but curiosity. What did she see that they didn't? Why did she breathe differently behind the scope? Why did her body settle faster than theirs? The answer, of course, was experience. Not just technical, but lived. During night shoot qualification, a misfire caused a momentary confusion. One candidate froze on the line. The others pulled back. Arya, from 3 spots down, stepped forward and calmly flagged the misaligned bolt without hesitation. It was subtle, but it was decisive. One of the instructors noted it, quietly, in pencil. That's how growth is recorded in these places, not with praise, but with observations. Arya's physical scores were never top of the board. She wasn't the fastest. She didn't outlift the larger men, but no one could beat her in mental endurance. She could hold prone for hours without complaint, could calculate corrections faster than most rangefinders, could fire 5 rounds into a 3-inch group after a 12-mile ruck without missing cadence. And most importantly, she never explained how she did any of it. She just did. Some of the younger men began asking her quiet questions between evolutions. Nothing formal, just curiosity. What do you think about the wind this morning? How do you time your breathing? She always answered simply, never instructing, never posturing. And as the training weeks passed, something subtle happened. The candidates stopped seeing her as a mystery and started seeing her as a standard. On the final week, during a long-range engagement assessment, Arya took her position on the line. The morning was cold, wind steady, mirage flat. A new instructor, unaware of her story, paused behind her and made a casual comment. "You don't have to shoot if you're not ready, ma'am." She didn't reply. The first shot rang out, dead center, 100 yards. The instructor didn't speak again. Ward, watching from the tower, said nothing either, but he smiled, just slightly. Because what they were watching now wasn't just skill. It was discipline forged by silence. The kind that doesn't demand respect but earns it before you realize it's already happened. Arya Dalton walked off the line without celebration. No fist pump, no nod, no acknowledgement of what had just been proven. And still everyone noticed. Because by now, they understood. You don't measure a sniper by how they shoot when people are watching. You measure them by how they prepare when no one is. The final selection roster was posted on a plain bulletin board outside the operations office. No announcement, no ceremony. Just a sheet of white paper with a list of names, printed, pinned, final. Arya Dalton's name was third from the top. No bold font, no asterisk, but those who saw it didn't need embellishment to understand what it meant. The list meant she had done it, not passed by the edge, but solidly earned her place. There were no more questions, no lingering doubts, just a quiet, collective understanding that this wasn't an accident or a surprise. It was the natural conclusion of everything they'd seen unfold in silence. Later that afternoon, Arya returned to the range, not for training, not even to shoot. She stood behind the firing benches, watching 2 newer candidates struggle through mirage corrections on a difficult midday crosswind. They didn't see her at first, too focused, too frustrated. She said nothing, only watching the slight bend in their elbows, the hesitation in their breathing. Then one of them, the same young soldier who'd asked her about wind reading weeks earlier, turned his head, spotted her, and froze. "Lieutenant Dalton," he said, voice quiet. You got a second?" She stepped forward, not smiling, but not distant either. The other soldier moved aside, offering the rifle like a question. Arya didn't take it. Instead, she glanced downrange, took a slow breath, then said, "Check your rear flags. You're reading the mirage wrong. Wind shifts at 500. They both adjusted, fired. The round landed near center. No cheer followed, just stunned relief. "Thank you, ma'am." She gave a simple nod and stepped back. That was it. Word had already begun to spread outside the selection circle. Among officers, NCOs, even across battalions, not loud stories, just recollections told in smaller voices. Some said she had served in a classified Valley Op. Others mentioned a general salute. A few still weren't sure what the ink on her arm meant, but they no longer asked with sarcasm. They asked with curiosity, with caution. Staff Sergeant Ward crossed paths with Arya again a few days later. He found her near the perimeter road, walking alone after range hours. The sun was low, shadows long. He didn't interrupt her stride, just walked alongside until their paces matched. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said, "I used to think silence meant hesitation, second-guessing. But watching you..." He stopped, not because he didn't have words, but because none of them felt necessary anymore. Arya looked ahead, then replied softly, "Silence isn't always hesitation. Sometimes it's just clarity." Ward nodded. You'll make a damn good shooter, not because of the rifle, because of the restraint. They parted ways without farewell. Some conversations didn't need endings. In the days that followed, Arya began preparing for the next phase: advanced school, operational clearance, and eventual team integration. Nothing flashy, no reassignment ceremony, no promotion speeches. Just paperwork, medical reviews, and gear checks. She handled it all the same way she had handled everything else. Quietly, precisely, without asking for attention. One morning, a young logistics corporal spotted her in the armory, inspecting her optics kit. He lingered near the door for a moment before finally speaking. "I was there. That day on the range," he said. "I was one of the ones who—" "Yeah." Arya didn't turn around. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I know," he replied, "but I needed to." He paused again. "It changed how I look at people. Just wanted you to know that." She finally looked over her shoulder, not smiling, but not cold. Then it was worth it. Arya Dalton didn't become a legend that week. She didn't want to. She wasn't a symbol or a myth. She was a professional. And professionalism, in its purest form, doesn't require recognition. It simply requires discipline in moments where no one is watching and dignity when everyone is. Back at the range, the steel targets had been freshly repainted. The 1,000-yard plate still carried the faint indent of the round she'd put through center weeks earlier, barely visible now under the new coat. But those who saw it remembered. Because sometimes the most unforgettable marks aren't left by noise. They're left by accuracy, consistency, and restraint. Qualities that no rank can assign. Only time and silence can reveal them. True strength is almost never loud. In the military and in life, the people who leave the deepest marks are often the ones who speak the least. Arya Dalton didn't prove her worth by shouting over others or demanding validation. She didn't tell the room she was capable. She simply was and let her actions tell the story. In a world where loud voices often drown out quiet ones, her journey is a reminder that restraint, discipline, and consistency are far more powerful than showmanship. She carried a history no one knew about, bore the weight of it silently, and only revealed it when the moment demanded not for pride, but for purpose. Respect, once earned in silence, carries more weight than 1,000 declarations shouted into the wind. Because real warriors don't need to be recognized. They just need to be ready. If this story stayed with you even after the last shot faded, consider subscribing. We share more like it. Quiet stories, real moments, the kind worth remembering. Thanks for being here.